Hello and welcome. I'm Brent Glass, Interim Executive Director of the National Building Museum, and I'm very pleased to welcome you and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Narrating the Border Wall, part of the museum's ongoing celebration of our 40th anniversary. The museum is the country's foremost institution dedicated to telling stories about and inspiring curiosity and knowledge about the built world, the places we play, work, and live in. For more than 4 decades, we have presented and celebrated exhibitions that have touched on everything from design and construction to advances in sustainability and resilience to issues on social justice. And tonight's program is no exception by advancing the museum's role as a thought leader and addressing important and timely topics. If you enjoy what you see tonight, please consider supporting the museum with a gift to the museum's annual fund. If you're not a member already, please consider joining us. And you can go to our website, wwnbm.org, to join as a member. If you're already a member, thank you for supporting the museum. And I also want to thank all our sponsors who have made this event possible tonight. It is now my pleasure to welcome Kathy Frankel, the museum's Vice President of Collections and Exhibitions. Enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Brent. I am Kathy Frankel. I'm the museum's Vice President for Exhibitions and Collections. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's program and give you a little background on how our speakers came to end up in Texas on the U.S. Mexico border. The Wall El Muro, What is a Border Wall exhibition, was the brainchild of Sarah Levitt. Sarah is the curator of our acclaimed Evicted exhibition that was on view in 2018 and 2019 and continues to tour the U.S. Coming off of that exhibition, it became more apparent than ever that there was a growing appetite for both our staff and our visitors to enter into challenging conversations about our built environment. We believe that the museum has a responsibility to inform and educate about current issues in which the built environment plays a role. And when we began to work on this exhibition, we realized that no topic was more timely than our southern border. As Sarah began thinking about what this exhibition could be, we decided 2 things. First, that we needed design partners from the outset to help us think about how we depict something that is simultaneously a megastructure, sometimes no structure at all, but is also intangibles like policy and ideas. We were lucky enough to be able to bring back our partners from the Evicted exhibition, architect Sandra Wheeler from Matter Practice and graphic designer Sarah Gephardt from Management Design. The second early decision was that without seeing the border, it would be nearly impossible for Sarah to be able to fully grasp the enormity of the border, not to mention understand the complexity of everything that goes on in the border, from ecological issues to economic impact, to the complicated processing of travel over the border every day, and this country's changing immigration policy. Sarah returned from her trips to the border practically breathless and with a notebook full of observations and a phone full of photos. It was immediately apparent that doing an exhibition on the border wasn't just something we wanted to do, it was something that we had to do. So before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to give a quick update on when this exhibition will open. We are planning to open the museum sometime this spring, but this exhibition will not be up until hopefully the fall. We don't have an exact date just yet, so keep a lookout on our webpage for an announcement of that. And we are able to take on this exhibition and present it to you in the fall because of the generosity of our funders, the Avangrid Foundation, the Venable Foundation, George Corey and Cynthia Cruz, and the museum's Field Fund. And now I will turn the program over to Sarah Levitt, the curator of the Wall El Muro, and also a curator at the Capitol Jewish Museum, who wisely enlisted friends and colleagues to travel with her to the border, and said friend who enthusiastically joined Sarah on her trip to Texas, Marla Miller, professor of history and director of the public history program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Welcome, Sarah and Marla.
I'm so glad you're all here joining us tonight. We're gonna show a lot of pictures and slides today. Starting with our trip to Texas, as Kathy mentioned, and of course, I first want to thank Kathy Frankel for your vision always, and especially for promoting this project over the last several years. One of the things I wanted to start by talking about is where we started. How do you make an exhibition? Once you decide that you're going to do an exhibition about the border wall, what happens next? And to do that, I'm going to start way back by talking a little bit about a trip that Dr. Miller and I took several years ago now. This is going to take us all the way back to the mid-90s. Marla and I met actually in 1991, so it's been 20 years. And over that time, we've taken many adventures to historic sites all over the U.S. So, and now we've added Mexico to that list. So hopefully our pictures are so small in the squares that you can just imagine us as we looked 20 years ago, right there on your screen. Okay, so here's what we're going to do tonight. I realize now that I'm talking that probably our faces are covering half the words, but I'm going to first talk to you a little bit about how we put together an exhibition, where we start, what kind of journeys and research trips we take along that way. And I'm going to show you some images of the trips to the border that I took with Marla in 2019, and then with two other people in the end of 2019 and the very beginning of 2020, of course, before everything shut down. I'm going to then pass it on to Marla, who will talk a little bit about border marker number 1, which we saw in New Mexico, right on the Texas border, and of course the Mexico border. And then she'll talk about the National Historic Register program and really talk a little bit about how we choose what we commemorate as a nation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit to you about the upcoming exhibition that Kathy mentioned. And all the way through, we kind of want you to be thinking about how do public historians and exhibitions tell complex stories, and how should they be telling these complex stories about the U.S. Mexico border? So we started out with the big idea at the Building Museum that the border wall between the U.S. and Mexico is indeed one of the most significant built environment projects of our time. So how do we talk about it? Well, first I want to show you where the border wall is. This is the most up-to-date graphic I could find. This is the red, of course, is the border wall that's currently built, and this is up to date as of January 25th. My understanding is that the USCPB BP is the United States Customs and Border Protection, and my understanding is that construction stopped right around then. I believe the date was the 27th that Biden signed the executive order that the construction on the border wall would stop. But I want to be clear that that doesn't mean the border wall is coming down. The border wall is still there and will be there as far as we know, even if Biden doesn't build any extra miles, and we'll see how that progresses during his administration. The border wall itself has a long history. We could definitely talk about that in the Q&A, or when you come to the exhibition, you'll learn all about that, starting really from the 1920s. And then the border wall as we know it dates from the 1990s. I want to be clear also right before we start, we're talking about a border that is really both open and closed. This is the initiative on the Border Patrol website, Homeland Security website, that really points to this issue. So a lot of times you hear in the press that the border is closed. It is closed for certain people, but there's constantly, every day, thousands of trucks, trains, cars crossing the border between the U.S. and Mexico who are deemed essential. So the border is both closed and open, and that's, I think, really kind of an important dichotomy to hold in your hand as you think about the border. So here is where I went when I went to visit the border. I took a look at this map. These are daily entries. This is, of course, from 2019. Daily entries are way down. They're about half as much now. And you can see that they have up-to-date entries by all kinds of vehicles and pedestrians at every single land port of entry. And you can just look that up on the internet if you're ever interested. So these are the three places I went to go see. We started, and we'll talk a little bit more about El Paso tonight. Also then went to California, San Diego, the San Isidro, which is the heaviest trafficked border land port of entry in the country, and probably one of the biggest ones in the world, and Nogales, which is in Arizona, and then into Sonora, Mexico. So those are the three places that you'll be seeing photos of today. We'll start with an aerial view from an airplane. This photo didn't used to be nostalgic when I looked at it, but now it feels a little like, oh, I remember airplanes. So you can see the border wall through the center of the picture. So if you're from the top, you're looking at Mexico and the mountains, and then you come down and you can see the border. And you can really, I love this image because you can really see the scar of the wall on the landscape there. And then that's El Paso, Texas on the bottom of the screen. So of course, one thing before you do any exhibition, I just want to very briefly run through some of the people that we talked to. So these were all people that we met in Texas. Some attorneys who work with refugees and migrants on both sides of the border. We'll talk about a little bit more about them. A gentleman in the middle works for the U.S. boundary, the water boundary administration, monitoring the dam and the boundary between New Mexico and Mexico, and we'll get to that a little more. And then Border Patrol. So of course, any exhibition, of course, there's a lot of reading to do, there's a lot of traveling to do, and then there's also people who experience these events. I also talked to a lot of tourists as I crossed the border back and forth, especially in Arizona. These are some migrants from Honduras that I talked to in a migrant shelter in Tijuana. And on the right is a photo of an activist who used to bring, I guess, before this past year, clothing and toys back and forth across the border. So I had a lot of opportunities to talk to a lot of people who kind of approach the border and who live the experience of the border in all kinds of ways. And of course, we'll be hearing from them in the exhibition. Okay, so the Building Museum, of course, is a museum about our built world, why the world is built the way it is. And I want to be clear that we will talk about some border policy, but mostly this is an exhibition about the border infrastructure, how it changes over time, and we're not here to necessarily debate border policy, and we'll get into some of how we deal with that. So let's start with the wall. This is a major infrastructure project, and we visited it as many places as we could. This is the wall in West Texas near Marfa. You can see it cutting across the screen there. Here's what the wall looks like from through most of El Paso. You can see it's there's a lot of water infrastructure, especially around the Rio Grande and El Paso to deter it around the city. And so the giant Rio Grande ends up being kind of a little trickle right through El Paso, and it's concretized on all sides. So that's the wall there. Here, so you'll notice that the pictures on the U.S. side are all just the metal color. On the Mexico side, a lot of the wall is painted and has murals on it. These are people who have died making the crossing. That's what these are. This is the Friendship Garden, which is kind of a fascinating place in crossing over from Tijuana to San Diego. This is an attempt to show that some things, can't be stopped with a border wall, including, for example, gardens, vegetables and plants, which grow on both sides of this wall. They did tear this down pretty soon after I saw it. Just actually a couple of weeks, it was completely bulldozed. So there it is. And here's the border wall going into the Pacific Ocean right there in San Diego. You can kind of see the murals on the other side. There it's painted all the way down on the Mexico side. A lot of people ask when they see this picture, can't you just swim around the wall in the water or take a boat around the wall? And yes, of course you can, and people do it every day. There's Border Patrol. There's a lot of Border Patrol standing right on that beach, and I did talk to them about their experiences watching boats make that passage every day. This is what the border wall looks like in Nogales. It's completely covered in razor wire on the U.S. side, not on the Mexico side. And of course, we want to point out that it's not just the wall that we're talking about. Border infrastructure is so much bigger. We started calling it the borderplex, which was a term that we heard when we were down in Texas. This idea of the borderplex, meaning that it spreads the infrastructure. It's kind of an industrial complex of border infrastructure everywhere. So this is just some. This is what I mentioned, that we talked to the gentleman at the International Boundary and Water Commission, that they run the dam and distribute water back and forth based on various treaties that we have with Mexico. So that is in actually Sunland Park, New Mexico, which is just a suburb of El Paso. There's guard towers everywhere. There's a lot of watchtowers. There's a lot of drones. And this is in so-called Friendship Park in California, where it's just lined with watchtowers. So they're monitoring the area very closely, and that's certainly part of the infrastructure. Another part of the infrastructure is in Mexico. There's many migrant shelters, and this is one where I spent some time. It's actually a migrant cooperative, so it's run by migrants, and they distribute food and clothing every day. They still do. Now I am a monthly contributor to this operation, because they're really doing some beautiful work with people who are who get to Tijuana from Central America mostly. And so that's part of the infrastructure too. There's shelters all over the border that are helping house the migrants, especially in the past year with the Remain in Mexico program. Here's another part of the infrastructure, the border, the El Paso Processing Center. So Marla and I got the chance to follow a lawyer for a day, and we came in here and talked to migrants who have made it across the border and are requesting asylum. We, of course, weren't allowed to take pictures inside, so this is as close as we got. And Marla will talk a little bit more about that later. There's also an entire infrastructure of land ports of entry. This one I took so many pictures of, and I can talk a little bit more about it later, but this is the Mariposa land port of entry in Nogales, and this one actually won several architecture awards. This is the tunnel that you have to walk through to get to the center, and I found it very unwelcoming. So I took a lot of pictures of it. The other part of the infrastructure to note is that border infrastructure comes 100 miles inland from the border with these checkpoints, immigration checkpoints. And we drove around to kind of go through as many as we could. And they ask, at that point, they ask if you're a U.S. citizen. They are allowed to, there's some waiving of search and seizure rules, and they are allowed to search your car. Of course, as you can imagine, when Marla and I came through as two white women, we just said, yes, we're U.S. citizens, and they let us through. But we wanted to kind of have that experience as much as possible, which is certainly not an experience I have driving around Maryland. So that was, I think, instructional for us. Okay, so the borderplex is everywhere, and now I'm going to pass it over to Marla to talk a little bit about how we read its history in the landscape.
Hi, everybody. I want to add my thanks to the Building Museum for having us tonight, and I want to say thank you to Sarah for letting me accompany her on this journey. It was a really powerful experience, and I just feel fortunate to know Sarah and to be part of her work this way. I thought I would start by just saying something about the lens that I bring to the project, which is not as a preservation professional, although I'm going to talk about preservation practice a little bit, but more as a public historian and a public history educator. So I tend to be interested in how these stories get interpreted in the landscape, in museums and historic sites, and heritage trails, and all of those kinds of expressions of what we would call past keeping. But also I'm interested in the history of that work and how something might have been interpreted 50 years ago versus how it's interpreted today. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that through the lens of border marker number 1. So Sarah and I flew out to El Paso together. We met at the airport, and our first order of business was to find boundary marker number 1, which is the oldest piece of border infrastructure here. And it sits now alongside the newest piece of border infrastructure, which is the so-called GoFundMe wall in Sunland Park. So, we got our rental car and we were all ready to go find this. And we, Googled it, as one does, and tried to find our way to this marker. But that was easier said than done. We started to find the marker described on sites for people who are into wayfinding as a hobby, just, checking off markers like this. But there were warnings on these websites, increasingly dire, that if you accidentally find yourself in Mexico, if you take the wrong turn on these dirt roads, you will probably be detained in Juarez, and it'll take a couple of days to get back, be turned over to U.S. border agents. So we decided we would not chance it, that we did not have the wayfinding skills to get ourselves safely there. So we thought we would pursue more official channels, and we called up the International Boundary and Water Commission. Easy to find their phone number. We knew that they are the holders of access to this site. According to their website, the commission's mission is to, quote, provide binational solutions to issues that arise during the application of U.S. Mexico treaties regarding boundary demarcation, national ownership of waters, sanitation, water quality, and flood control in the border region. So they are not a pass-keeping organization, and it really shouldn't have surprised us that we were pretty low priority. Our request to access the marker was passed around through several employees. And finally, pretty close to 5 o'clock, we learned that everyone had gone for the day, and we would not be accessing the border, and could we come back in a month? So that was disappointing, but we decided that we would just set that aside and do the other work we wanted to do, and then, take another try at that on Monday. In the meantime, we headed to another site that interprets the border, and that's the Chamazal National Memorial, which is a National Park Service site in El Paso. So this memorial celebrates the Chamazol Convention of 1963, which it marks the peaceful resolution of a century-long border dispute that was caused when the Rio Grande changed course through the years. Obviously rivers are not necessarily stable, and there was a big flood, especially in the 1860s. And in the aftermath of the flood, the river channel moved, and territory that had once been entirely in Mexico was now entirely in the U.S. And there had been tension over the years about that land and other land that was affected by the movement of the river. So a century later, by the 1960s, the U.S. government, in the midst of the Cold War, wants to make sure that relations with Mexico remain healthy. And so finally, they decide to address this issue diplomatically. And we get the Chamazal Convention, which gave the disputed land back to Mexico. About 5,000 U.S. citizens living on that land had to vacate it. That land was returned to Mexico. There were some other changes of lands too. But most importantly, the channel that Sarah showed earlier, the Rio Grande, was confined to this permanent cement channel, like the concrete channel. They just decided, like, we can't have this river wandering around. This has got to be made permanent. And so the river was put in a fixed position. And then lastly, this park that's illustrated on the slide here, the Chamazal National Memorial, is part of that convention, part of the agreement that there would be a, quote, peace park, which would celebrate goodwill, understanding, diplomacy, and cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. So this park quickly came under the administration of the National Park Service as the Chamazal National Memorial. And on their website, we noticed that they described this as one of two memorials that celebrate the peaceful diplomatic resolution of a border dispute. So I'll just show you the other one. It's the Peace Arch, built in 1921. This is in Blaine, Washington. And this commemorates the end of hostilities in the War of 1812 and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. It was developed pretty much at the centennial of those events. It was opened, created in 1921, and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1996. That reads, its significance is as a, quote, significant emblem of international harmony and the promotion of social unity across borders, as well as an important example of monumental commemorative art. So we start to see, and I'll show you a few more slides of other border markers, and how this is acknowledged and recognized on the National Register. So we had some of the travels that Sarah has described in the meantime, but on the morning of our flight home, we were, determined to see this monument. So we took one last stab at it, and we just drove out to the commission headquarters and, knocked on the door. And the gentleman that answered the door directed us to the staff person that you saw in an earlier image with Sarah and he on the dam. And he walked us as far as he could along the dam, and we could see the monument in the distance. And that was, somewhat satisfying. But we walked back into the parking lot and he said, did you get what you needed? And we were both kind of like, sort of. And there was a big pause. And finally, he and another staff member said, well, do you want us to just lead you there? You can follow us in your car. And we said, absolutely. We about ran to get the rental car and followed these two gentlemen to the site. On the way, they stopped and showed us some dinosaur footprints, which was an unexpected treat and really, I think, knocked us back a little bit to think about the long history of this landscape. So in the slide, you see the marker as it appeared in the 19th century and as it appears today. It's one of 258 19th century monuments that mark the land border between the U.S. and Mexico. And today, because the monument sits south of the Rio Grande, it's in Mexico. The site was named to the National Register of Historic Places in 1974, and that's the same year that the Chamazal National Memorial was created. So the mid-70s is a moment that people are documenting this work. And when I went to look, here we have a scene from the 19th century, and you see the monument just, existing in the midst of this small community here at this neighborhood, really in Juarez. So we went to look at the nomination form, and the first thing for those of you who are familiar with the paperwork around the National Register of Historic Places, the first thing I noticed is that access is unrestricted. And, I guess technically it is unrestricted, although Sarah and I certainly found that is somewhat compromised today. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. The nomination, as they do, narrates the monument's or the border marker's history and its appearance from its installation through various repairs to the present. You see that it was beautified in 1966. That's probably related and prompted by the Chamazol Convention and the treaty and attention now back to the border marker. And there's a lot of effort to make the marker more of a park-like setting, and you see on the slide all of the organizations that contributed to that work. It was quite a binational effort to make this more of a site that tourists might want to visit. So what we see here is the monument sort of changing its function and purpose. So this is the mid-70s that this is put on the register. It's around the bicentennial. And shortly thereafter, in 1976, in bicentennial recognition, the American Society of Civil Engineers named the marker a historic civil engineering landmark. The designation lauds the, quote, superb surveying skills of William Emery and the Emery-Salazar Commission that pinpointed the exact boundary between the U.S. and Mexico across some 2,000 miles of uncharted territory. So in some writing that Sarah and I have done about this, we propose that what was once a marker is now officially a monument. It's taken on a commemorative role and more of a historic site context, and has a lot of new valences to it. And that was accelerated also around 2011 when the Casa de Adobe was created. This is a historic house museum that is just a few feet from the border marker. This opened in, as I say, 2011, and it marks the history of the Mexican Revolution. We couldn't get anywhere near it today. I don't know when any other time would be that Sarah and I were that close to a historic house museum and did not get in it. But it also changes the valence of the site. It has now a lot of historic resonance across that whole landscape. But thinking about how that landscape has changed, marker number one is very different now than it was even in 2011, let alone 1974 or 1874. And it's become heavily militarized. And so in these two slides, you see an image on the left, just up the, maybe go back a little bit. Yeah. On the left, you see what the hill behind the monument looked like at the time. And on the right is a slide or a photo that Sarah and I took of the policing of the monument. And in the middle on the left, you can kind of see there's a little chain fence. And if you continue, you can make that out in the detail shot and then kind of get a glimpse of where that is today, just that little marker. And the new GoFundMe wall just to the right of it there. And then Sarah, on the next one, you see how very different this landscape looks today. And so if we look at a couple of other slides, we can think about how the National Register of Historic Places does and does not, and maybe could, account for this kind of change over time. So I'm using a quote here from my colleague, John H. Frankel Jr., who I think might be on the call tonight. So if you are, big hello, and thank you for your work, John. This is from an essay that John published in a volume called Bending the Future that I had the privilege of co-editing with my colleague, Max Page. And this line nicely summarizes what the register can be seen as. And as I was rereading this for the talk tonight, I was thinking about a little bit about historiography, how these monuments change over time. So if we go ahead, this is from John's essay too, just to make the point about how things might have been described and thought about in a certain framework at the time that they were nominated, and that might evolve. So this is John's example from his essay, The Confederate Capital, which was put on the register in the 1960s when people were very much thinking about the Civil War centennial. And so it was titled isn't the right word, but the Confederate Capital, which is not necessarily how we would think about it today, but this is how it is on the register. And as John points out in his essay, only 3% of 90,000 listings get updated for content. So this is the kind of thing I want us to be thinking about a little bit as we look at some of these other monuments and how they've changed over time. This is the space that Sarah showed a slide of earlier, the marker at San Diego, listed in 1974, the same year as the El Paso marker. Again, it's a park-like setting, but if you look at Sarah's image from that same site today, again, it's very different. And so if we think about the way the National Register nominations describe the context and the setting of these memorials, they are dramatically different today than they once were. And so once we started thinking about the National Register, I was wondering where else this story is documented. I mean, border markers are one category of resources. Here's another one up in Bellingham, Washington, that is again on the National Register. So that's a constellation of resources that we can think about. Another category that I got interested in were these inspection stations. There are many inspection stations that are all documented on the National Register, but I was surprised to see that most of the ones that are documented are actually at the northern border. And you notice there's 10 in Vermont. So that took me by surprise. Only one in Texas is now listed on the National Register. And then I just want to give a shout out to a really great project that if you're interested in this, it's written up on the National Council of Public History blog, History at Work. This is a neighborhood in El Paso that had seen some threat. There was a highway project that threatened some of the historic fabric in the neighborhood. And the neighbors and other entities got together to prevent that from happening. Now the highway goes up over the neighborhood. But the neighborhood was put on the National Trust's list of most endangered sites. And there was a really robust conversation with the community that developed in time, about how they would like to see some of those impacts of the highway mitigated. And out of it came some K-12 educators material that was really successful. And really just more importantly, some changed policies and practices at the Texas DOT as people rethought how they should engaging the community around border questions. And then we thought a little bit about the future, like what else could be happening. Naturally, I wondered if the detention center that we visited could be someday on the National Register. It's past the 50-year mark, which is often cited as the threshold. This would be a complicated site to write about, but worth thinking about. And then lastly, Sarah mentioned the Borderplex, and I wonder about sites of advocacy and sites of activism. This site I did look up to see where it sits in El Paso, and it is officially not historic at the moment. It sits right outside a historic district that has been established, and it's a fairly new building. But I think as we think forward about what we'll want to document, I hope that these sites of activism and advocacy will also become a category that interprets this border history. And so with that, I'll hand the baton back to Sarah.
Excellent. Well, I hope that we've convinced you from this brief discussion tonight that exhibiting the border is worthwhile and is complicated. I think both of those things are true and really sat on and weighed on us as we tried to think about what does it look like to exhibit the border. So I kind of went first to, as any good Ph.D. historian will do, first to the books. So these are all of the books that I read or looked at about that scholars, novelists, poets, all kinds of people have written about the border. If anyone's interested in my bibliography, we could talk later. But certainly this is a very well-traveled subject from all different perspectives. And it's really interesting to kind of see what the difference would be between a book about the border and then showing people an exhibition about the border. So what would an exhibition particularly look like? Well, so I saw over the past couple of years as many kind of museum exhibitions, just art, especially art displays, of which there are many, about the border that we could. This is a museum that we went to visit in El Paso, the Border Patrol Museum. And so this is how the Fraternal Order of Retired Border Patrol officers tells their own story. And it's very, I'll show you some photos of the exhibitions. You'll see that it is maybe not the most nuanced story that we've ever seen. This, for example, is some microfilm that they had, a microfilm machine. This is talking about the paperwork that the Border Patrol deals with every year. There was a Border Patrol vehicle in the museum. So this is the type of artifact. They also had this rope ladder. And as you can see, I actually can't read this. Sorry, because our pictures are over it. But the point of showing you this is to talk about what it would mean to write labels and to interpret this type of material. So this is a rope ladder that was used to climb the border fencing in 2010. It's in this museum, as you can see, I think you can see on the bottom there, as an example that the Border Patrol agents meet the challenges of the smuggler's ingenuity. Okay, so that is definitely a point of view, and one that doesn't tell the story of the person who used that ladder and why they were there and what they were using it for and what issues they might have had or what context they might have had. And it also doesn't tell you really about, why the wall is there and why people might be compelled to climb over it. So that is an important thing to note, to read the labels and try to figure out what whose point of view the museums are discussing. This is the exhibition that is up now, although I guess the museum is closed, but it is up now at American History Museum at the Smithsonian here in DC, Many Voices, One Nation. And you can see behind the display that chain link fence is a piece of the border wall. And we will have another piece of that same, that border fence, which is a 1950s border fence from Calexico, California. And they also have some objects that were collected from migrants and that they had left behind in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. Those objects find many homes and many people telling their stories, and we will have some of these objects in the exhibit at the Building Museum. Here are some of those objects being used in an exhibition called Hostile Terrain that traveled the country, but I saw it at Franklin and Marshall in Pennsylvania in January of 2019. So this is a story, this is an exhibition that really told the story of the border from the perspective of the migrants who are encountering that hostile terrain. That's a official term from a U.S. Document from the 1990s. The purpose of the border fence was to create such a hostile terrain that the migrants would have to walk through. And of course, that has caused thousands of deaths. A lot of artists have interpreted the border. This is a exhibition that was at the Peel Museum in Baltimore a couple of years ago, in which several artists interpreted different aspects of the border and asked the visitor to kind of put themselves in different positions. The image on the right is actually a bottle of water that was collected by a professor of ecology and geography at the University of Alabama. He studies the border specifically at Otay Mesa, California. His name is Jared Margulies, and he actually also records sound at the border. And so one of the things that we're going to have in the exhibition, I was so taken by his work that I called him up and we actually sent him back to Otay Mesa to record some sound of the border for us for our exhibition. So that's exciting. Which brings us, of course, here to the National Building Museum. And what the exhibition will hopefully look like when it opens there. So what does an exhibition about border infrastructure looks like? Of course, the Building Museum is a museum of the built environment, the world we build for ourselves, and how do we kind of look in the mirror and see what that world is at the border. One thing I want to just be clear about is that of course, the border wall might be controversial, but having a conversation about the border wall is not controversial. Of course, bringing a saw to the border wall to try to, I did not actually try to saw the border wall, I promise. I just posed for the picture. But the conversation and the responses to these questions are really what we're mostly interested in. So what is a border wall? What should it look like? If you were going to design a border, what would it look like? And as Marla, I think, has shown really beautifully with those photographs, this is not inevitable. This is not what the border always was going to look like. It's not what the border always looked like, even as recently as 10 years ago, in many places, in many cases. So we really need to think that the border looks the way it does because we built it that way. And what does that mean? What does that say about us? What does that say about our policy? And is there a better way? Is there a way that we can think differently as we move forward? By incorporating those stories of people who cross the border, hopefully we can get to a better place. So here are some, these are just schematics. They're just renderings. And obviously will look much more exciting in person, but I wanted to show you some of the renderings just so you kind of get a feel of it. And all of these renderings, again, are schematics by the designers, the fantastic designers that Kathy mentioned at the top, management design and matter practice architecture. This is I think you'll recognize the border slats here as part of the design that follow all the way through, as you see the title as you walk into the exhibition. This is the floor plan. Just put it here so you can see the course that you'll take through the exhibition. The yellow, highlighted yellow entrances and doorways are an opportunity. I think I have a slide of that, yes, to ask questions. So we're hoping that visitors will stop a little bit in that doorway and think, maybe talk to each other, about various questions. For example, what is a border? Why do we have borders? Where is the border? That might be you might kind of get different answers once you have been through the exhibition. What would a just border look like? And these are kind of questions that we want people to have in their heads as they move through the show. This is my favorite part of the whole show. It's like a good historian will tell you. This is the timeline. This timeline has 3 sections to it. I'm only showing you one here, which is the bottom line that says tracking the fear. I really wanted to be clear that as the timeline progresses, you'll see immigration policy, U.S. immigration policy over time. You'll see additions to the built environment, to the infrastructure of the border over time. And then at the bottom, we have these, I was calling them ribbons of fear. Why do we have a border wall? Why all this buildup at the border? Where does it come from? And it's really because this pile up of fears that we've had over the past couple centuries, that certainly drug smuggling and and illegal immigration are among the top things that have always been worrisome, but disease, interestingly, was one of the first reasons for the border wall in terms of cattle disease. And that was one of the first fences that was put up in California along the border, was to prevent cows from going back and forth. And of course, they closed much traffic to the border during the pandemic, we can really kind of add that to the list as another element of fear of viruses crossing the border that was not part of our earlier timeline. So as you can see, things do change. So I just want to show you a couple things that will be on display. I hope you recognize these. I put this one in here because you've seen some of the shapes. These are all the border markers. They're models made by an architect in Mexico City, Nathan Friedman, who has carefully rendered all of these border markers in the same materials as the original, as they were made in stone. And those will be displayed at the same scale as the border wall that has been put up under the Trump administration. These are the 6 prototypes of the new border wall that has been put up in the last couple of years, at the same scale as these border markers, to kind of show the change over time as these transfer, as Marla discussed, from that idea of a border marker to really more of a monument, as the border is marked in very different ways. We also will have a piece of the original border fence. This piece of fence has a fascinating story. I'll try not to go down that rabbit hole at the moment, but it was this fence was put up in Calexico. It was surplus, Army Corps of Engineers surplus from a Japanese internment camp that had closed after World War II, and they repurposed the fence and put it at the border. It was then taken down in the 1990s when they put up the current fence and donated to the Smithsonian. So they have it here. On the bottom, it's reinforced there on the bottom with World War II helicopter landing pads, and you can see that is actually a common thing. A lot of border fence in the 1990s was built from repurposed helicopter landing pads from Vietnam. So you can see the surplus of the Army Corps of Engineers ends up creating immigration and border policy in lots of different ways. This is one of our maybe more fun objects. You can see the poster kind of in the distance there. It looks like that the half circle. This was a photo of the land port of entry in Del Rio, Texas from 1978, showing this welcome sign, which was part of a series of welcome signs that were painted by the pop artist Peter Max in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial. And GSA, the General Services Administration, actually still owns all the posters, the original paintings as well. So we'll have one of those to show. They were supposed to welcome people to the U.S. It ended up, this particular poster was criticized for being too psychedelic and looking too much like we're condoning drug use. So they were shelved for a while and then put back up after a number of years. So that's kind of a fun story. And they were on the border on both the south and the northern border, southern and northern border, for many years in the late 70s. So another thing that we're going to talk about in the exhibition is numbers. It's really important to understand the border. You have to know how many people we're dealing with in terms of number of Border Patrol agents that rises exponentially along the border. The third one that maybe you can't see is the number of people detained per day by year under 6 presidents. And then that first one on the left is the miles of wall built by each president. And I guess we'll see what will happen with President Biden, but certainly our wall, as it is now, the kind of modern version of the security fence or the wall was built over time by 4 presidents and appropriated money by many Congresses. It's really important to me that people understand that this is not just something that kind of came out of thin air in the last administration, but was certainly part of a long story of our government funding for this wall. I apologize that you can't really see this very well, but I want to tell you a little bit about this animation because this is the borderplex kind of spreading across the nation. So the idea here is that this is an animation and the layers of the border will be added one by one. And this is what you're looking at now is all of them together. the shaded section along the entire border of the United States is that 100-mile border inspection area that we were talking about before, where you can be asked, search and seizure rules are relaxed, and that you can be asked for your citizenship papers within those areas. The dots and different shapes on here also represent detention centers. We hold migrants in detention centers all over the country. And actually, when Marla and I were at the El Paso Detention Center with the attorney, he had come to see one of his clients who had that morning been transferred to a detention center in Florida without him knowing. And so he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to be in touch with her or how she was going to get representation. So that is certainly an issue with the detention centers as they are all over the country. Also, I wanted to think about how the border comes to you. So almost anywhere you live within the country, there's something related to the borderplex near you. And we've driven up to for example, the ICE detention center up in Jessup, Maryland, which is not far from DC. So the border certainly reaches here in various ways. And that is true in many areas. It's also true that when any airport that welcomes international travelers to the United States also represents the border. And that's why there's, of course, immigration checkpoints at those airports as well. So there's a lot of different layers here showing the Drug Enforcement Agency's offices and all kinds of different ports of entry especially on the northern and southern borders, of course. So that's what that is. So I just want to end, I guess, by saying that these questions of should we have a border wall and what should our border look like? These are good questions. And hopefully, we'll provide maybe some answers, but also more questions. I think we certainly haven't figured this out as a nation. And as a museum, our job should be as a museum that tries to educate people about what our role is in building our own world and designing the world the way it should be. It's kind of our job, I think, to help visitors come up with thoughtful answers and maybe, think a little bit more about the border in ways that perhaps they hadn't thought of before. And we're hoping certainly that that's through the National Register program and through all these other programs that we do have the tools for, that there can be lots of places all over the country that can really address these questions as we continue to wrestle as a nation with what to do with our border policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Marla. I'm popping back on to sort of help with some questions here to navigate some of these. So much great information. I'm sort of more enthusiastic than ever, and I was already enthusiastic about this show. So thank you so much. I did see one comment in the Q&A or the chat mentioning the pink Teeter-Totters, which people who have seen mostly love, but I wonder, Sarah, if you want to mention their inclusion in the show. So. Yeah,
so you might be familiar, you can certainly Google it. The pink Teeter-Totters at the border was a kind of an art installation that was put up in August of 2019 by two architects who have spent Virginia Sanfratello and Teddy, what's his name? His name is
Real is last.
Yes, thank you. So it's right. Sorry, that just escaped me for a second, but they have been working on the kind of more creative ways to challenge people's idea of what a border is for 10 years. And you can go and see their designs. They have some of their designs at MoMA that show planting a garden or making a xylophone, making the border wall into a xylophone. And one of them is this teeter-totter. So they had this idea, and the drawing, I believe, is from about 10 years ago, where half the teeter-totters on one side is in Mexico and the other half is in the US. And of course, the teeter-totter depends. You can't ride it by yourself. You need people on both sides. So it was that idea that we would need to work together to form a solution to what to do with the border. And so they installed it. They actually installed 3 pink teeter-totters at the border wall in Sunland Park, New Mexico, which is it's right where Marla and I were, right in that suburb of El Paso. And they installed it one day in August, and they had people on both sides riding the seesaw. So we had the opportunity to bring those Teeter-Totters to DC and to put them in the exhibition and kind of build a wall between them, and have people have that opportunity to kind of see that the lever of the seesaw. So they're now in the gallery, right? All three of them, kind of waiting for the exhibition. And I know they're in high demand. A lot of other art museums want them. In that last gallery of the exhibition, we hope to kind of explore how the idea there is to question the border. And so we hope to explore a number of different artists and how they've kind of painted the border wall. There's one artist that paints the border wall slats so it looks like the sky with clouds. So if you stand back from it, it kind of erases the wall. And there's a lot of other kind of things that artists have done. So the question is in the gallery, and we'll be talking about this, whether visitors will be able to get on the Teeter-Totters, and stay tuned.
We hope so. We hope we can figure a way to make that happen. Thanks, Sarah. I have another question about wildlife migrations. I know, Sarah, we talked about it a little bit, but wondering, and Marla, you mentioned it in as much as changing the river a little bit, sort of, can you talk a little bit about how that's going to be included or what you discovered on your trip to Texas?
Sure, I could talk about that a little bit. I mean, the most striking image that we're going to be including, I think, is actually them tearing down cacti at the saguaro cacti and the Organ Pipe National Monument. And there's a lot of controversy about that because there's a lot of, especially the Tohono O'odham and other people think of those are protected saguaro cactuses in Arizona because they're sacred, and instead the Border Patrol is ripping them out of the ground to put in the border wall. There's a lot of talk also about the National Butterfly Center, and we have some in Texas because the border wall is going to pass through their land. There's also a lot of animals that migrate in that area. There's ocelots and other wildlife that migrate, and that the border wall will and has already changed their migration patterns. So we will be addressing in kind of an area where we talk about flora and fauna crossing the border. And I've added recently the idea of viruses. Viruses, of course, also cross the border. We're less concerned with restricting or not restricting the free travel of viruses, but that's certainly part of the story.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I have a question, maybe Marla, this one's good for you, asking if there was a time period when the fencing and heavy infrastructure ramped up significantly, or has this been gradual over time?
Well, that's actually probably more one for Sarah too. I mean, I was surprised in my, when I was looking through those sites, how recently you see images, like Sarah showed that great image of Marfa and the border wall there. And there are other images that just show a barbed wire fence that are not that old. So I don't know, Sarah, that's probably more in your wheelhouse. Yeah,
the ramp up of the fence as we know it now was in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. And that is when in kind of a trade-off for certain immigration reform and border buildup certainly happened in that period. So from the 90s and certainly into the Bush administration and under Obama, and then of course under President Trump as well. So in those 4 presidencies is really where you see the bulk of the wall as we know it now. But so it was probably gradual, I guess I would say, there was a period of buildup in the 20s and then a pretty big buildup in certain locations in the 1950s. And that's where you see a lot of that chain link fence. It was in the 1950s. And then another bump up in the 1990s through, January.
Great. Here's a more political question about the political ramifications of the U.S. Mexico wall in contrast to those with the Berlin Wall. I don't know if you want to maybe address sort of how you're going to compare what's going on the southern border with across the country, across the world.
I was actually in Tijuana, which is right across across the border in Mexico, across the border from San Diego. And I was in Tijuana on the anniversary. Now I'm trying to figure out what anniversary it was, but it was in November of 2019, and the anniversary of the Berlin Wall falling. And so there was a German NPR reporter there who was talking to people about how now, he was also pointing out how, and I think I showed this, that the Mexico side of the wall is painted and the U.S. side of the wall isn't. And if you kind of imagine in your mind the West German side of the Berlin Wall versus the East German side of the Berlin Wall, the U.S. is the East German in that equation, which isn't great. And so he was interviewing people along the wall about what they thought about that. Certainly there's a lot of famous border walls around the world. We do have a map in the show showing all the border walls that are currently standing worldwide, all over. There's certainly Russia has a great deal of border wall infrastructure. Israel is almost entirely surrounded by a border wall. So there's certainly other countries that are right there with us building border walls. And there's plenty of conflicts around the world. Kosovo. There's other places where in Africa there's several. Latin America and South America are actually mostly exempt from border walls, but everywhere else in the world we certainly have them, and we will be showing that some images in the show. Also going back in history, I think if you think about border walls, you think of Hadrian's Wall and the Great Wall of China. There's certainly this idea that that walls are kind of this ancient idea, this ancient technology that we have transformed or made more sinister, or I don't know what word you want to use, or made more serious. And in many ways, can't have a horse jump over it anymore.
Great. And I'm going to conflate a couple of questions here. One, asking Sarah, you commented on the law that map that you showed had the 100 miles around the border, stopping people within 100 miles of the border. Do you know when that law was passed? Another question, talking about the virtual wall, which in some ways, in my mind anyway, is part of this, for where there's no wall or in these other spaces, that we're monitoring that with remote surveillance and drones, et cetera. Is this something that's going to be addressed further?
Yeah, so there's a lot of balloons, surveillance balloons also is something that we have a photo of that can, and drones, of course. There's a lot of different technologies that have been used over time. There's a lot of great images actually from the 1920s of, especially in Arizona, Nogales. That was one of the main crossing spots, and of watchtowers with a person standing in the watchtower with binoculars. So that's kind of from that to write this idea of this virtual wall, I guess, or invisible. There's other ways of tracking people. So yeah, I don't think that. A lot of that Border Patrol isn't super excited about sharing for obvious reasons. I did talk to I had about an hour conversation with a Border Patrol agent in San Diego, because I was fascinated, and people ask me that all the time about people boating and swimming around the wall. And he told me about some technologies, and they're watching. They have there's boats that can evade certain types of radar, and so they follow that with some other kind, whatever. And so that's a balance back and forth as the technology gets better from the migrant side and from the U.S. side, and they battle it back and forth. So there will be certainly some of those stories. I would have to look up exactly when that law is from, so I could do that really quick. But I guess I will let somebody else, whoever asked the question. But yes, there's been various iterations of it over time, and it comes back and forth as a controversy because we normally, the rest of the nation, we are not asked for our citizen papers. I drive all around with nobody asking me if I'm a citizen every day, and for those 3 trips, I got a sense of what. As a white person, I don't have as much of a sense, obviously, but I did get a sense of at least what it's like to be stopped on the highway every day. If you're driving that way to work, you can be stopped every day. Are you a citizen? Are you a citizen? It's different than what they experience in the rest of the country, so that's significant.
Great. To pivot sort of completely on this, have you talked to the Army Corps of Engineers at all, and sort of how are we talking about infrastructure of this project and engineering of this project?
I did kind of a deep dive in the Army Corps of Engineer records because I was trying to figure out, and there's a historian at the New School who's also been working on this, and I kind of picked off her research as well, in terms of the Vietnam era helicopter landing pads. So that was kind of one area where the Corps really shows up, because that's just such a fascinating story. They think that, and I don't have the number of miles written down right in front of me, but they know how many miles of a border wall was put up that was literally surplused helicopter landing pads, and somebody had the idea to like turn them up on their side and make that into the border wall. And we were trying to figure out if those exact landing pads had actually were in Vietnam and then came back, or if those were just surplus the whole time. And that's a hard thing to figure out because of the way that the Army Corps of Engineers records are at the archives. That's a rabbit hole. So anyway, but that's kind of where the Army Corps of Engineers shows up in terms of the specific engineering design of the wall. That's something that probably that's not particularly a question I was interested in, because I'm more interested not necessarily in specifics of how they build it, but in why and in what that means.
Great, thanks. Marla, I'm going to lob one at you, which is, how has the language about borders changed over time?
And that's interesting. I was in looking through those older records, again, it's this shift, I think, from a utilitarian, marker of, this is here and this is there, and not as charged as they've become. And so obviously now when we're looking at boundary markers and the border, I think that there's an important linguistic thing happening when you're talking about boundaries versus borders. For some reason, when we talk about a border wall, that's a charged phrase. And for some reason, I think boundary waters, we talk about boundaries, and that feels less heated. So I think just the way we've started talking about the infrastructure of the border is a signal of a changing attitude.
I just have two comments about that one. I think that's great. I just noticed, I just got an alert on my phone that President Biden gave a talk today, made a statement today that we should stop using the word alien to describe somebody who crosses the border illegally, and use the word non-citizen. So that is a new rule that came down from the president's office, the executive office today. And I did just look that up while Marla was answering the question, so thanks for that. On the ACLU website, if you're interested, has a pretty long treatise on this issue, but the regulations establishing the 100-mile border zone were adopted by the U.S. Department of Justice, by DOJ, in 1953. So that goes back a pretty long time.
I'm looking at a question that I might sort of from the museum kind of answer, saying that we've stayed apolitical, fairly speaking, so far in this conversation. But there are issues, the human component of this, and the suffering and depiction of children in cages. And I think Sarah said at the beginning, like, not something we are entering into in the exhibition per se, sort of sticking with the built environment on that, but absolutely something that we'll, as the programming around this exhibition, this is our first program about the exhibition, pre-exhibition. As the programming is developed, we are certain to sort of move off in other directions and address all sorts of issues around immigration and the border wall. So, well, Sarah, you want to say something else on that?
Well, always. I did just want to say that we do have a graphic that shows detention centers, and so we will be talking a little bit about when we started detaining migrants, which was really built up with Haitian and Cuban migrants, especially in the 80s. And I think it's important to kind of talk about that history, that it didn't just start, but that it changed over time, and how one thing that it changed certainly was separating children from their parents, but also the number of days that people spend in detention, I think, is an important difference. And that does change significantly over time. So we will be talking about that.
Great. How about, how much has the architecture design profession been involved in the border? And do you know when that started?
when that started, well, I mean,
When architects
it's true, I think, but certainly, when they were building those inspection stations, and I don't know, Marla, you might know in the historic register nominations for those inspection stations, does it talk about the architects?
Yeah, I should, off the top of my head, I would want to review that. But I did when I was looking at the El Paso Detention Center, I very much wanted to find the architect for the original structure. And, it's pandemic times, it's very difficult to do any kind of digging, but with the help of the very capable librarians at UMass, we weren't able to find that remotely anyway. So it's not easily accessible to find who the original architect was of that structure.
Certainly, the AIA does give design awards for land ports of entry for sure, and like the one in the Mariposa land port of entry in Nogales that I mentioned. So those are architects of record are certainly there. The AIA has had, and I did talk with a bunch of people on various committees a couple of years ago, because there were some committees that were making statements that architects should not work on any infrastructure related to the border. I think they specifically meant detention centers and the border wall, probably more than the land ports of entry. But I think that certainly a lot of firms have kind of drawn that line and said they're not going to be part of designing that type of building. In terms of how long, if you look at the old border inspector stations that are 100 years old now, somebody designed them. So, it's a different, maybe I'm sure that the field of architecture and certainly landscape architecture has changed a lot over that 100 years. But certainly when you're talking about the fence, especially the chain link fence that was unrolled from either from a Japanese internment camp or from a helicopter landing pad, then you're not talking about architects with a capital A per se, but certainly in the buildings, absolutely architects were involved.
A question about Canada and the Canadian border. For many decades, the U.S.-Canada border has been described with pride as the longest undefended international boundary in the world, but that seems to be ending. Do you know why? How have you seen that change?
Undefended, I would not call it.
Now than they used to be.
There used to be more Border Patrol agents on the northern border than the southern border. And it's at different times when they were especially concerned about, during Prohibition, when they were concerned about alcohol smuggling coming over the northern border. That was certainly, and there's Border Patrol all across the northern border. So I wouldn't say it's undefended. Certainly there's land ports of entry there. I think that with the development of Homeland Security and understanding how people get into the country in different ways, I think that certainly Homeland Security has amped up surveillance at both borders, absolutely, and that dates from just after 9/11, so it's relatively recent.
I just did a quick check of the inspection stations that I downloaded, and in the first few that I opened, just as Sarah was talking, I didn't see architects listed, so that'd be worth looking into further to see. But also to this question about Canada, I feel like one of the things that the exhibit will do that is so important is helping people notice all the different ways a border can be experienced. Certainly the border at Bellingham looks different than the border at El Paso, looks different from the border at Vermont. And I think it's just a helpful reminder. And Sarah made this point so nicely at the top of her remarks that it's so easy to forget that the way it is not the way it needs to be and wasn't that way even very recently. And so I think just thinking about different borders that we've all experienced just reminds us of the very different ways that can be experienced and the different infrastructure you can pass through.
Yeah, and if anyone who travels or will travel again someday, certainly I think Europe is such an interesting example because especially within the EU and the Schengen Agreement, the borders there are I'm talking about before the pandemic when they did reclose again, but you just drive through and there's just a different sign. You've entered Belgium, you've entered France. And there's a park where you can go and you can be in 3 different countries at once. And, Europe was ravaged by war in the 20th century, right? And these are places that, these are literal war zones. And now it's just a park. So it's certainly something that just because it's one way now doesn't mean that it has to be that way in 50 years.
And if I can just throw in, I mean, that's part of the reason I think we got so interested in Chamazal and finding out what the other example was of a site that exists to mark the peaceful resolution of a border dispute is they're like monuments to diplomacy. And so it's just interesting to me, at least, that that's a thread that we could pursue further. Where do we celebrate diplomacy as a resolution in our built environment or in our nation's historic record? So that seems to speak to that too. Like this is a moment to celebrate talking it out and what that can achieve.
Great. Sarah, I got another one for you. You talked a little bit about when you were had the slides up earlier about the different way it looks from the Mexican side and from the U.S. side. But what about that experience? How does it feel different? Because I know you were on both sides on all three of your trips.
Oh, how long do you have? I first of all, especially in Nogales, I think was the most surreal experience walking from the U.S. to Mexico, because you just open a door. You literally there's a border wall and there's armed guards everywhere. And then you open a door and you walk into Mexico. And that's all. That just says, the only sign that says you can't bring a handgun into Mexico. Because in Mexico, they're worried about all the guns in the U.S. They don't want them across the border. So that was kind of the most striking experience. In California, in San Diego, there's this place called Friendship Park that was dedicated by Pat Nixon, actually. And she made this beautiful speech about how now we're friends and we have this beautiful park. It's that slide that Marla showed with the kind of the big triangular monument that was in a park, and now it's in Mexico and it's behind this huge fence. And on the U.S. side, so this is where the fence, the border wall really is so militarized, and there's so many people trying to cross there, or were trying to cross there. So now on the U.S. side, there's like an anteroom. So there's a double fence, a double 10-foot high steel bollard fence. And there's this anteroom in the middle of it. And for 3 hours, I want to say, on Sundays, the one door opens and you can go into this anteroom from the U.S. side, and then you can talk to your friends or relatives from the Mexico side. So the Mexico side is always open and anyone can go there at any time. But the U.S. side, you can't get anywhere near it to talk to anybody except for these 3 hours. And the experience of being there. So we did that from the U.S. and it's a mesh also when you get there, because they don't want people passing things back and forth. So it's literally a mesh. I kind of could stick my pinky, but not even my whole pinky through. So there's the steel bollards, and then there's like a steel screen in between all the bollards. And the next day we were on the Mexico side, and the experience there is, so I was with a friend at that point who speaks Spanish, and so she went up and talked to a lot of people. There were people who were bringing their baby to the wall so that their family on both sides could see the baby for the first time. There was grandma being wheeled up to the wall, and people were sitting there for hours. We were there for a long time watching people and just kind of being there. So right at the wall, that's kind of the experience, and it's overwhelming, and I wouldn't really know how to describe it, but right, like a couple yards away from that, it's like the beach, and people are just at the beach with their family, and there's like carts with beach stuff for sale and flavored waters and snacks, and people are at the beach. And then there's a migrant shelter like right there. So it's like the juxtaposition of all that is there's definitely a lot on the Mexico side. On the U.S. side, there was nobody there. There were some surfers. And then there's the family members that come at that particular time. So the border wall is a pretty, I would say, intense place all the way. And certainly that was my experience on all the way on both sides. And when we crossed over in Juarez, when we went, it was right in the middle of the Remain in Mexico program. So when we got to the Mexico side, there was people everywhere that were kind of stuck there. And that you get the sense it's a city of millions of people. We only saw just right around the border fence right there. But it's it's not a, there's a lot going on there. And there's lots of different people's stories, but we talked to some migrants at one of the centers there who had come from Cuba and Venezuela. And they were telling us some pretty gruesome stories. So that it's a difficult place.
Thanks, Sarah. One sort of 1.5 last questions. Brent, I don't know if you popped in, if you have a question as well.
No, I just I think it's a great program. I just thought about one of the most famous boundaries in America certainly is the Mason-Dixon line, and that was the result of a border dispute between Maryland and Pennsylvania in the 18th century. And also the line itself, civil engineers still marvel at the fact of how accurate it is, creating that boundary between the two states. And then in the 19th century took on a whole new meaning as the boundary between slavery and freedom. So it's interesting to see how these boundaries and borders, and there are markers, so there were every mile for about more than 200 miles of markers with a P on one side and an M on the other, marking the two states. But I do want to thank Sarah and Marla and Kathy, and just to say the museum will reopen shortly in the next few weeks. We're getting ready. But go ahead with the rest of the questions, Kathy.
No, thanks. That's really interesting. I appreciate that. So sort of a 2-part question from someone asking whether other historians that you're talking to out there, other people who are looking at the history of borders and are helping as you navigate these sort of fairly treacherous waters to talk about the border. It's not an easy thing to talk about. So I'll let you answer that one first, and then I'll ask the last one.
Yes, absolutely. If you saw that, though, I can show you my bookshelf again, but I've reached out to a lot of different scholars in different fields. I think that's really important. Like I mentioned that there was somebody in ecology and geography, certainly political science professors, and there's no shortage of scholars who are looking at how we talk about the border. And absolutely, yes, I'm happy to, if somebody wants to contact me directly, we can have that conversation. But yes,
your bibliography.
No, absolutely. And one of the other, when I went to Arizona, I traveled with Beth Hurd, who's a professor of political science at Northwestern University, and she's actually teaching a class right now that I helped a little with her syllabus, and she's teaching a class on the border and on border policy for college freshmen at Northwestern. So it's been fun I'm going to speak to her class in a couple of weeks, but it's fun to see how students are reacting to it in a different way, and I think that's very helpful in terms of the kind of pre-studies as we try to figure out who. What people know about the border, what they want to know, and how to help people understand what's happening there. And I know, Marla, you had some students that came and did some work for us too. So that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, Marla, how are your students talking about this? Is this something?
Well, after Sarah and I returned, my department, some folks in the department suggested that, there might be interest in hearing about the trip. And so I gave a short talk, and a couple of our students were very inspired by the work that Sarah was doing. And we had 2 students who did remote internships before they were a thing. So they worked from UMass Public History with Sarah to help her, I think, locate objects and photos and images, but just doing that kind of legwork that you have to do, combing through collections to find, relevant material. So they were very engaged. It's an urgent topic, and I think most public historians, want to be engaged in it and are engaged in it. All over the country, there are public historians who are tackling this from wherever their point of view is in the country. So it's an urgent topic that I think most public historians want to help generate conversation about. There's a figure in my universe who is always very inspiring to me, and she once used the phrase to provoke, not prescribe. And I think exhibits like this have the opportunity to really provoke the kind of thoughtful approach to borders that Sarah is steering toward.
Great. Thanks, Marla. which leads me sort of partially answers, but I'll let Sarah answer it too, sort of what you hope our visitors are going to get out of this exhibition once we build it and open it in the fall.
Yeah, I always want visitors to have good conversations, to talk to each other, to think about something that maybe they hadn't thought about it before. That's always what I'm interested in. Changing minds is fine, and maybe appropriate at different times, but I think I just think it's lovely if people can come into an exhibition and maybe leave changed a little bit. It kind of sticks in your head. Something comes up when somebody else mentions the border wall and you remember something you saw. So I want visitors to start asking more questions of their elected officials and kind of have the background to be able to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Marla. I really appreciate you pulling this conversation together. This is a great sneak peek for everybody. Thanks to all of you watching for participating as well, for the wonderful questions and comments. We are really grateful to have you around. And like I said, come see us later this year. Hopefully, keep a lookout in the fall for us to open this wonderful exhibition. Putting a plug in here, sort of, as Brent mentioned at the beginning, we are a private nonprofit, and we welcome additional sponsors to this exhibition. So if you're able and so inclined, please reach out to our development department team members. We are looking forward to developing a really robust set of programs for this in addition to the exhibition. So we could use all the funding we can get to really share this important subject and change some minds, hopefully. And I think maybe you all saw in the chat, this has been recorded and it will go up in about 10 days, a slightly edited version in about 10 days. So please share it far and wide. And we hope to see you again next time. Thanks, everybody.